Good evening, everyone. I'm your guide for tonight, here to weave some chilling road trip tales that will ease you into slumber. Before we embark on this journey, don't forget to subscribe and give a thumbs up to the video. I'd be thrilled to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is, so feel free to share in the comments. Now, when you're ready, find your cozy spot and let yourself unwind. The tale I am about to recount unfolded in the town where my father spent his childhood, and it stands as one of the most chilling narratives I have ever encountered. He grew up in an ancient coastal town where legends and superstitions were treated with utmost seriousness. Close to his home lay an abandoned estate that sparked both fear and intrigue among the locals. This grand and architecturally stunning house, with foundations tracing back to colonial times, was once the property of a prosperous Spanish landowner. However, in the early 20th century, it was acquired by a landowner of African descent named Nero Anery. Even my father mentioned that many neighbors believed they had inherited a sort of sinister pact passed down through generations, which explained their immense wealth. One might dismiss these claims as mere conjecture and gossip from envious and spiteful individuals with nothing better to occupy their time. However, there was indeed a substantial reason for the townspeople to harbor such beliefs, particularly concerning that vast. A house stood shielded by towering concrete walls, where unsettling and eerie occurrences began to unfold, sparking a myriad of speculations over the years. It all commenced in 1920 when, one fateful morning, Ernesto and Sarah inexplicably locked themselves in a room of the house and set themselves ablaze, tragically ending their lives. This shocking event sent ripples through the village, not only because it marked the first instance of such horror in that location, but also due to the chilling tales that emerged just days prior to that dreadful incident. An unusual sighting occurred when a man was accompanied by a large black dog, an animal unfamiliar to anyone in the vicinity. Witnesses noted that the creature seemed to materialize out of thin air, remaining steadfastly by the man's side. This raised eyebrows, as neighbors recalled that throughout the years I had resided there, he had never owned a pet. In fact, those closest to him asserted that he had little affection for animals. The mystery deepened after his passing, as the eerie dog vanished without a trace, prompting Ernesto and Sai's wife to seek a new home following the unsettling event. With their 3 younger children, while their eldest son stayed living in the property until 1940, when he also died in strange circumstances in the same house when he was the same age as his father. 40 years old, this second tragic event only strengthened the rumors that the house was cursed, as was the Wanery family. After this event, the house remained uninhabited for a couple of years, until in 1945. Diego and Sai, the youngest son of the family, returned from Spain after getting married and decided to move into the old house with his wife, 0246. But not before making some renovations. However, it was from here that things took a very sinister turn. Diego's wife was young and very beautiful, tall, slender, with beautiful blonde hair and a very charismatic personality. Her name was Alicia, and it is said that from the moment she arrived in town, she began to arouse the interest of many men. The girl received many compliments wherever she went in. Some men did not even care that she was married to try to court her, sometimes even in front of her husband. This was something that, infuriated, the man reacted violently on more than one occasion, not only against those who dared to flirt with his wife, but also against her. It is said that he became increasingly jealous and controlling, to the point of not allowing her to go out alone. According to the locals, the arguments between the couple grew more frequent, all stemming from his unhealthy jealousy. However, just a couple of years after moving into the house, a new tragic event shook the town once again. One morning, the town was shaken by the tragic news that young Alicia de Aner, only 22 years old, had taken her own life. Her husband reportedly discovered her hanging from a rope in their bedroom. This incident stirred a tremendous uproar, primarily because Alicia's kind nature and vibrant personality had endeared her to all her neighbors. Furthermore, disbelief permeated the community. No one could fathom that she would choose to end her own life. Many speculated that her husband, Diego, driven by his unhealthy jealousy, was somehow involved. His young wife suffered harm. Yet the town's prefect accepted the husband's account as truth. The townsfolk, however, remained skeptical, fully aware of his ties to a wealthy family and the debts he owed to the Ainaries. Following that fateful day, eerie occurrences began to unfold within the vast estate, reinforcing the community's conviction that Diego Ainary had indeed taken his wife's life and that the house itself was cursed. Since that tragic event in 1945, unsettling and ghostly happenings have persisted, began to unfold in the Unser house, defying the expectations of many. Diego remained on the property for several more years, yet he often found himself at the family estate. The man even had a substantial wall constructed around the building. But it was unavoidable that the neighbors would become aware of the peculiar sounds and mysterious happenings that transpired there, regardless of the hour or the owner's presence. Within the house, one could hear thumping against the walls, lights flickering on and off independently, and objects tumbling to the ground. The floor creaked ominously, and what was even more chilling at night, when silence enveloped everything, was the distant sound of a woman weeping. Occasionally, there were screams, and sometimes laughter echoed through the air. The townsfolk were convinced it was the spirit of Alicia roaming the house in search of justice. The nearby residents believed that all these supernatural occurrences, the eerie noises, the flickering lights, the objects colliding with the walls, and the haunting cries, originated from the very room where Alicia's lifeless body had been discovered. A few years later, Diego and Siri crossed paths. Another young woman, the daughter of a prominent landowner in the area, married and relocated to a nearby town, leaving the house entirely uninhabited. The villagers claimed that every week he returned, carrying bags filled with candles, flowers, and offerings in an attempt to appease the restless spirit of his deceased wife. However, these gestures proved futile as supernatural occurrences persisted. Over time, the neighbors grew accustomed to these events, and the house transformed into a sort of emblem of the town. Yet, it would take 40 years before an extraordinary event finally unveiled the entire truth about what truly transpired with Alice of Ainary. Yet no one was ready for that chilling revelation. In 1986, when my father was just 11 years old, the legend of the cursed house was already infamous in the village and beyond. As the years passed, the tale spread, attracting many curious souls from distant places eager to witness the property and determine the veracity of the legend. Over the decades, numerous individuals attempted to purchase the estate, but Diego and Sai consistently rejected every offer made. There were many curious individuals attempting to gain entry to the house, but it was nearly impossible due to the towering walls fortified with spikes at the top. However, in 1985, a significant earthquake struck the area, resulting in the loss of numerous properties and severe damage to others. Until that point, the house had gone unnoticed, but it seemed that during this natural disaster, a large rock collided with the back of the wall, which was overgrown with weeds, creating a substantial opening in that section. One afternoon, my father was engaged in a game of soccer with other children from the village when one of them struck the ball with such force that it soared behind the ominous house. Observing the ball's trajectory, the boys exchanged glances and decided to turn it into a challenge, drawing lots to determine who would venture into that forbidden area to retrieve it. As fate would have it, my dad emerged as one of the fortunate winners. Alongside 4 other brave souls, he navigated through the underbrush, heading towards the spot where they believed the ball had landed. While searching, they stumbled upon a hole, and as they approached the concrete wall, a wave of fear washed over them, prompting a hasty retreat to share their discovery with their friends. After some discussion, the children resolved to venture inside the old, cursed house of the Answer, but not before crafting a wooden cross and reciting Psalm 91, just in case the situation turned dire. My father recounted that upon entering, they found the place choked with weeds. Yet they persevered, reaching the entrance of the house. However, their progress halted at the door, which remained unyielding. The back door and a side door leading to a large porch were padlocked. After exploring the surroundings for a way to access the interior of the enormous house, they discovered a window without a protective grille. The frame was wide enough for a person to slip through, so they broke the glass and entered. My dad recounted that upon stepping inside, everything was shrouded in dust and spiderwebs, embodying all the eerie characteristics one would anticipate from a haunted house. After exploring various parts of the house, including the upper rooms, they noticed a hallway that led to a heavy iron door, locked from the outside with a massive padlock. Curiosity piqued, they approached and attempted to move it, but as they did, horrifying screams echoed from the other side. Instantly, my father and the other children were engulfed in terror, sprinting away as the screams continued relentlessly. The boys dashed out of the house in a frantic hurry, went to inform the other neighbors about their encounter with the ghost of the cursed house. Upon hearing the children's tale, a group of neighbors ventured inside and reached the door they had indicated. They too heard the screams, but while the more superstitious among them suggested seeking a priest and holy water for an exorcism, the skeptics proposed a more rational explanation. They decided to break down the door, and when they finally did, they could hardly believe their eyes. They are dressed only in an old, worn, out of her robe, with hair cascading down to her ankles and completely white, her nails nearly as long as her hair. Alicia Diener lay severely malnourished, curled up in a ball on an old, dirty bed. The woman they all believed had been dead for 40 years. It turns out that Alicia, once the young and beautiful wife of Diego and Sai, never took her own life. Instead, this ruthless and very sick man kept her captive in a room of that vast house for more than 4 decades, while he made everyone believe she had ended her own life. The saddest part of all this is the cacophony of banging, wailing, and flickering lights that captivated the attention of those who ventured near the house for 4 decades were misinterpreted as ghostly manifestations. In truth, they were Alicia's desperate cries for help, her attempts to escape the confines of her nightmarish prison, yet no one responded to her pleas. Her husband's weekly visits to the old house were not driven by a desire to appease any spirits, but rather to deliver food and water, a grim effort to keep her alive in that hellish existence. By the time rescue finally arrived, Alicia was 63 years old, her physical and mental state a testament to the years of torment she endured. Was in such a state of decline that a full recovery was impossible. Upon examination, doctors discovered old marks on her wrists, indicating that she had once attempted to take her own life. After this revelation, the authorities informed her relatives in Spain, who were equally shocked as the rest of the village, learning that Alicia had not been alive since 1945. Thankfully, they brought her back to her homeland to care for her, and there she spent her final years surrounded by her loved ones until she, at the age of 85, he finally departed this world. Diego and Sai faced a different fate, imprisoned and sentenced to 40 years for their crimes. Diego was diagnosed with prostate cancer just 2 years after his arrest. After enduring this illness for 3 more years, he ultimately lost his battle at the age of 68. My father recounted that following this tragic event, Diego's children chose to demolish the house and donated the land to a nonprofit foundation to build a children's hospital, likely with the intention of honoring his memory, clearing the family's name a bit, and in a way to erase from the town anything that could remind this macabre and shameful episode of their history. All my life, I have lived in a small agricultural town in southern Venezuela. This is a quiet and cheerful place where almost all of us know each other and are good neighbors. Like all old towns, this one also has its dark legends. However, the story I'm about to tell you has nothing to do with a myth from centuries ago, but with a very real and quite chilling event that happened. Years ago, an experience still sends shivers down my spine as I recall it. As I mentioned, this is an agricultural town, where most properties boast ample land, resulting in houses being spaced apart. Some properties enjoy more favorable locations, meaning they sit on fertile soil ideal for cultivation or near natural water sources like springs or creeks. Such properties are highly coveted in this area. Hardly any of these properties remain unoccupied, as expressing a desire to sell often results in a quick influx of cash. This has always piqued my interest in a certain property, whose original owners vanished long before my time. Despite its impressive construction, almost mansion-like, and its prime location near a natural spring, this house has been abandoned for over 40 years, with no one returning to claim it. Occasionally, someone has taken refuge there for a few days, but they either departed swiftly or did not emerge alive. I recall a moment from my childhood when I inquired of my grandfather about the inhabitants of that house, perched atop a hill and clearly visible from the main road. He recounted that the owner of that lovely estate was an old friend of his, a prosperous businessman who managed a well-known network of grocers in the city. However, after the tragic loss of his wife to leukemia, the man fell into a deep depression and ultimately took his own life within those very walls. My grandfather shared that after. The tragedy unfolded when one of the man's sons came and stayed for a while. It took him longer to remodel the house and build the pool than it would have to leave and sell the place immediately. Then came a new owner, a cattle rancher, who moved in and had grass planted all over the property, along with some trees that still stand today. He also constructed several paddocks and even installed an irrigation system, which remains, though it likely no longer functions. However, this new owner never had the chance to place a single cattle there, as just a few months later, another tragedy struck. This man was discovered hanging, and while his death was ruled a suicide, his daughter accused one of the workers from Hinda of being responsible. She claimed there had been issues between her father and this employee just days prior. According to her, her father had no motive for such an act. He was a joyful, healthy man with a bright future and numerous plans ahead. Thus, she was utterly convinced that the truth lay elsewhere, pointing to this worker had committed the crime and altered the scene to make it appear as though her father had taken his own life. However, the man denied everything, and the authorities found no evidence to incriminate him. Since then, the property was left alone, as the young woman had left the country and abandoned the place. The intriguing aspect of the story, which my grandfather shared with me when I was about 9 years old, is that this would not be the last time something like this occurred in that house. In fact, in the past 15 years, 2 comparable incidents unfolded, albeit in distinct circumstances. Approximately 12 years ago, 8 years after my grandfather departed from this world, the 17-year-old son of a neighbor left home following a heated argument with his parents. The boy had a long-standing struggle with alcohol and substance abuse, making conflicts with his family a common occurrence, as well as his frequent absences from home for days on end. However, this time, he would not come back safely, as about 4 days after the altercation, his situation took a tragic turn. In a quiet neighborhood, a group of boys set out to search for stray cattle near an old, abandoned house. As they approached, they sensed something unusual and decided to investigate. Upon entering, they stumbled upon a tragic sight: the body of a boy suspended from the ceiling in one of the rooms. This grim discovery sent shockwaves through the town, though it wasn't entirely surprising given the boy's troubled history, which had long suggested that such a fate was a possibility. At some point, however, that would not be the last time such an event would unfold within the walls of that abandoned house. About 8 years ago, in 2016, another very similar incident took place. Don Guillermo, a man of around 55 years, was the owner of one of the largest and most productive farms in the area. It was also well known that he had a penchant for certain vices, including fighting and alcoholic beverages. When it came to gambling, Don, along with all producers, traders, and entrepreneurs, faced significant challenges. Many suffered substantial financial losses due to the abrupt currency devaluation. Consequently, we were compelled to revise our budgets and implement critical economic strategies to navigate this crisis. However, this was not true for Don GMO, who stubbornly refused to alter his extravagant lifestyle and reckless habits. Even in the face of mounting losses, he chose not to pause his gambling activities, believing instead that he could turn his fortunes around. In an attempt to regain what he had lost, he placed even larger bets. To summarize, within just a few years, Don GMA transitioned from being one of the most successful landowners in the region to losing everything to gambling debts. He ultimately sold his ranch for a pittance to settle a substantial debt owed to his suppliers and the bank. His reckless gambling left him with no means to repay his obligations, a consequence of his poor choices and addiction. Don GMA's wife had left him in 2015, a year before the event, and had gone to live abroad with his children. He was completely alone, having lost his home, and began staying in the abandoned property. He started selling cheese door to door in town, but more importantly, everything he earned was spent on gambling and alcohol on the weekends. It was evident that this man was struggling mentally and emotionally at that point in his life. Therefore, when the news came that he had ended his life in that house he had been occupying, it was a tragic culmination of his circumstances. For several months, this did not surprise anyone, even though the event had occurred repeatedly at that property, almost always in the same manner. The truth is, in all instances, it appeared that these individuals were merely victims of their own circumstances. Naturally, there were always some superstitious folks who claimed the house was haunted and similar tales. But given the way these events unfolded, there was no reason to believe they were connected to anything beyond the ordinary, the misfortunes of each individual. Yet I quickly came to understand that my initial thoughts were quite misguided. As we often say around here, de vielen vone, they take flight. The next tale I wish to share involves my closest companion, whose true name I shall keep private out of respect for him. For the sake of this story, let's refer to him as Louise. Like me, Louise was born in this town and has spent his entire life here. We share the same age, and our mothers have been dear friends, so one could say our lives have been intertwined since birth. Similarly, we both embarked on the journey of marriage and raised our families. Our families are here, but in 2020, during the quarantine for COVID-19, my friend Louise and his wife, like millions of couples around the world, began to face challenges living together. Whether it was the stress of confinement, the economic struggles from being unable to work, the anxiety of battling an invisible enemy, or a combination of all these factors, their marriage became increasingly difficult. Eventually, it reached a point where cohabitation was no longer feasible. However, during that time of enforced social isolation, there were no options available. There are numerous options available when facing issues with a partner, yet Luis discovered a resolution that might surprise you. Following a heated argument with his wife, he gathered a few belongings and departed for an empty house. Although I couldn't see him in person for understandable reasons, we connected over the phone nearly every day. Despite being somewhat impacted by the turmoil with his wife and the chaos of quarantine, he exhibited no signs of despair or gloom. In moments of desperation, our conversations often turned into a whirlwind of jokes and laughter. Just last night, while he was at that house, we found ourselves chuckling about the absurdities we faced, all thanks to a silly bat. As we wrapped up our chat, laughter still echoing, I promised to bring him some essentials in the morning and to lend him my headphones for some musical distraction. As he had left his behind, he expressed his gratitude, and it felt like a small but meaningful connection amidst the chaos. It was a relief, really, because he was beginning to feel restless and despise the idea of going to bed early. After we ended the call, I thought that was the end of it. So, you can imagine my shock when I arrived that morning at the deserted house and caught sight of him through the window, his neck ensnared by a rope, the other end affixed to a hook in the ceiling. I witnessed the exact moment he leapt off the bench he had been standing on, hanging there in midair. Words failed to capture the intensity of what I felt in that instant. All I can say is that the breath I had in my lungs escaped in one swift rush. In a frantic rush, I discarded all the bags I was carrying and leapt out the window. Almost instantaneously, I found myself in that room, cradling my friend's lifeless body in my arms, screaming for help with every ounce of my being. I called out to him, desperate for any sign of consciousness, but he remained unresponsive. Though I knew he hadn't been out long enough to suffocate, a chilling fear gripped me. Had he broken his neck in that fateful jump? The depth of anguish and despair I felt is beyond words. Experience a moment like that, coupled with the overwhelming sense of helplessness that comes from knowing all I could do was pray that the worst hadn't occurred. Amidst the myriad thoughts racing through my mind in those fleeting minutes before help arrived, one question lingered. What transpired in those 8 or 9 hours that led him to make such a desperate choice, so uncharacteristic of him? I swear, had I not witnessed it with my own eyes, I would have found it hard to believe. After a brief pause, a considerable crowd began to gather. Neighbors rushed over, startled by my desperate calls for help. One friend quickly cut the rope, while others assisted in lowering Louise and attempted to administer first aid. Some neighbors even fetched a doctor from the nearby clinic to provide assistance. I recall being in a state of panic, repeatedly urging everyone not to move his neck, fearing a potential injury could worsen the situation. Thankfully, after a few minutes, my friend regained consciousness, and to everyone's astonishment, he was completely unaware of what had transpired. Luis had no clue why we were all gathered around him. He couldn't recall anything from just moments before. His wife was distraught, tears streaming down her face as she blamed herself for the situation. Around him, a flurry of questions erupted, with everyone pressing him about his well-being and the reasons behind his actions. He appeared bewildered, merely echoing his confusion, insisting that he had no memory of how he ended up there. In that moment, others suspected deceit, interpreting his bewilderment as shame or remorse for his actions. Yet, I understood my friend deeply. I recognized when he was truly lost. There was a sense of disbelief as I realized the situation was not as I initially thought. He was indeed being honest. He genuinely had no idea what was happening. The doctor assessed him, reminding us all to keep our distance and stay aware of the ongoing threat of the virus. After conducting some preliminary tests, the doctor determined that Louise had not sustained any significant injuries. His neck was intact, and thanks to my timely presence, he experienced minimal harm. Thankfully, my friend was safe, yet everything felt incredibly surreal. I sought clarity, yet I understood that this wasn't the moment for discussion. The priority was ensuring Louise made it home safely and began her recovery. That same day, my friend returned home and managed to address his marital issues positively. I stayed connected with him over the phone in the following days, deliberately steering clear of the events that transpired in the abandoned house. It wasn't until a week later that I had the chance to meet him, adhering to the necessary security protocols of the pandemic, and it was then he shared with me the intricate details of what transpired after our call. Louise attempted to divert his mind by playing a game on his phone, but with a dead battery, he opted for the hammock he had brought along and soon drifted off to sleep. It was from this point that the atmosphere shifted dramatically. My friend revealed that he dreamt of a striking woman, her fair skin adorned with freckles and her vibrant red curls cascading down. She wore a delicate, airy white dress. He lounged in his hammock, and I inquired about his troubles and his presence there. He shared that he was facing issues with his wife, which led him to leave home. However, with nowhere to go due to the quarantine, he chose to spend a few days in that house until things settled. He recounted how the lovely woman smiled at him, assuring him that his wife didn't deserve him and that he was worthy of something far better than solitude. Then, she extended her hand, inviting him to follow her, as if captivated by her allure. Louise complied with her request, taking her hand and following her as she led him through the house. They approached a garden visible beyond the front door, and it was precisely there that he found himself when, without warning, he jolted awake on the floor of that room, surrounded by the bustling sounds of half the town. My friend's revelation left me utterly stunned, sending chills down my spine, for I knew him well enough to recognize the truth in his words. Exaggerating anything. This made me reflect on the 4 previous victims and consider that perhaps they experienced something similar. They just weren't as fortunate as my friend. After enduring that terrifying ordeal, Luis began attending a Christian church with his wife and children, and eventually he was baptized into that faith. It took several months before my friend felt brave enough to share his testimony with the neighbors. Some believed him, while others remained skeptical. But the reality is that since that moment, no one ever. I dare to stay in that abandoned house. I was never a believer. On the contrary, I was an inveterate unbeliever. All those stories about apparitions and scares that I grew up hearing in my native Mexico, instead of frightening me, made me laugh. It seemed ridiculous that, at this point in life, people still took those superstitions seriously, tales invented long ago to scare children. But as I said, that was before I came face to face with terror and had to swallow my words. I was 19 years old and had just passed during the second semester of economics at UNAM, I found myself on vacation with no plans in sight. When my grandfather mentioned his upcoming journey to the Payan jungle in Guatemala to seek out a miraculous plant, I immediately jumped at the chance to join him. To provide some background, my grandfather was a botanist who owned a shop specializing in various ointments and natural remedies that promised to cure a multitude of ailments. His passion for his work often led him to the farthest corners of the continent, where he sought out exotic plants and ancient recipes for his creations. On this occasion, our destination was the Payan jungle in Guatemala, where a plant, according to the Ida, one of the many Mayan peoples of the area, was believed to have the power to cure cancer. Accompanying my grandfather on one of his expedition trips had always been a lifelong dream of mine. As I grew up captivated by the stories he shared about the places he had visited and the fantastic adventures he experienced in each of them, I was filled with excitement and anticipation as we prepared to leave for Guatemala together, though I never imagined that I would be on the brink of regretting that choice to the core. The journey stretched long and tumultuous, nearly 2 days traversing from Mexico City to the remote region, hindered by inclement weather and necessary stops for rest. Yet, we ultimately arrived at our destination, a quaint Mayan village nestled deep within a rainforest. There, we were greeted by the village shaman, an old acquaintance of my grandfather, whose hospitality was palpable despite his somewhat somber demeanor. He had thoughtfully prepared a couple of hammocks for us, and his wife was. As I was preparing dinner, exhaustion overtook me, and the moment I settled into the hammock, I slipped into a deep slumber until morning. I was roused by the soft murmur of voices speaking in an unfamiliar language. It was the shaman and, to my astonishment, my grandfather, who spoke the Mayan dialect with surprising fluency. They appeared to be engaged in a quiet discussion while my footsteps caught their attention. Both turned to face me, and I could see the concern etched on the shaman's face. It seemed he disagreed with my grandfather. The choice to venture out in search of the plant that morning was met with caution from the man, who advised against entering the jungle at that time. He warned that if we were determined to proceed, we must steer clear of the river as dusk approached and ensure our return before nightfall. This advice resonated with me. The threat of rain causing flash floods and the emergence of predators at night made the situation evidently perilous. However, I was taken aback to learn that our host's primary worry was not the dangers I had anticipated, but rather something else entirely. We encountered a creature that once haunted the rivers, instilling fear in the entire village. I must admit, I nearly laughed out loud at the absurdity of it all, but I held back to avoid being disrespectful. The situation struck me as quite humorous. However, it quickly became clear that when we sought a guide to accompany us, the locals were genuinely frightened, as no one was willing to join us, even with the promise of good compensation. Yet my grandfather was resolute, as we had to return the following day. When we were finally prepared to venture out on our own, a young boy, no older than 12, thin and short, offered to guide us. He appeared to be the only one unafraid of the Twyla. So, we set off with him in search of the plant, completely unaware of the terror that awaited us deep within that jungle. The weather was pleasant that day, but from the start, everything felt off. There was a palpable heaviness in the air that I could sense. The boy stayed quiet throughout the entire journey, carrying only a bamboo stick, which I assumed was meant to clear the vegetation. He had it tied to his waist and never used it. After several hours of walking alongside the river, as the afternoon light began to fade, the boy finally spoke. He urged us to leave the river and head up into the mountains, despite the fact that this would make our journey longer, as the river was the more direct route. Nevertheless, the boy was adamant. Though we could not be near that river because it was already beginning to get dark, we refused because we knew it was faster to get to the site by the river, and we were in that dilemma when suddenly a storm came out of nowhere, something that is not uncommon in rainforest, but this was quite unusual. The black clouds covered the sun in just a few seconds and a rain began to fall. But not only that, but behind the sound of rain and thunder, another noise could be heard, something that began as a kind of whisper but gradually became a sobbing, echoed like a haunting wail, unmistakably a woman's. The boy paused a moment of stillness, then shouted urgently for us to flee the water and follow him. We complied, though confusion clouded our minds. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder as we distanced ourselves, as if it were in pursuit. The boy guided us to a stone cave, our refuge from the relentless rain, but none of us were ready for the impending darkness. Suddenly, it enveloped us, a shadow descending, and the rain ceased to exist. The haunting wail of that woman gradually morphed into a guttural cry that sent chills down our spines, causing every hair on our bodies to stand on end. The sound intensified, swelling into anguished screams that reverberated through the forest, creating an atmosphere of sheer terror. I desperately wished to convince myself that it was merely an exotic animal producing such a horrific noise, yet I had never encountered any creature capable of such a sound, especially one so thunderous. The cries persisted, echoing as if they were piercing our ears. My grandfather and I exchanged terrified glances, and in that moment, it struck us who the specter, referred to as Subna, truly was. It was Laurona, the very same Laurona I had dismissed as mere folklore until she materialized before us. We stood frozen, unable to grasp the reality of our situation, as the boy unfastened the cane from his waist and began to strike the ground. As he uttered certain words in his language, the cries began to swell, growing louder and more desperate, echoing around us. Then, a final scream pierced the air, so deafening it nearly rendered us deaf. After that, silence enveloped us, as if time itself had paused for a fleeting moment. Just as swiftly as it had arrived, it vanished, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The strangeness of it all unfolded so quickly that, had my grandfather not been there to witness and hear the same events, I might have truly believed it was in a dreamlike state. I found myself inhaling the spores of a hallucinogenic jungle plant, leading to a surreal experience that felt undeniably real and quite frightening. After a period of eerie silence, we finally emerged from the cave, greeted by the normalcy of the night, the moon shining brightly and the jungle tranquil, as if nothing had transpired. We spent that night in the cave, hesitant to venture further, and the next morning, we set out to search for answers. We hurried back to the village with the blessed plant, eager to share our discovery. There, we learned that in the Itza language, the word Twyla translates to woman who cries. The quiet boy who accompanied us turned out to be the shaman's grandson, sent to protect us and ward off the Isla if we failed to find them. This experience reminded me never to underestimate myths and legends, as they can lead to unexpectedly frightening surprises, just like the one I encountered at the age of 8 in the early 80s while living with my parents. In a quaint town nestled in Mexico, despite its modest size, everything was remarkably well structured. There was a school, a small police station, a health center, and even a tiny fire station. Though many years have slipped by since I called it home, the memories remain vivid, so much so that I could easily sketch the entire town from memory. Having traversed its streets countless times on my bicycle, my brother, just a year younger, and I would often venture out to play until nightfall, our parents oblivious to the time. Concerned, as there was nothing to dread in that place, but everything shifted that evening. It was around 9 o'clock at night, a time when the entire town was already in slumber, for the residents had a habit of retiring early. My grandfather often remarked that the locals rose with the sun and settled down with the chickens. Gradually, our friends' parents summoned them one by one to return home for a bath, a meal, and rest. However, that night, my father was busy tinkering with his old truck in the garage, so he and my mother remained awake. So, caught up in the moment that we lost track of time, it was just my brother and me left playing outside the kindergarten down the street. The streetlights were always on, illuminating the yard clearly that night. With all our friends gone, we ventured to that spot and began our game. At one point, my brother playfully pushed me, causing my shoe to fly off. I went to search for it to put it back on, and then my brother urged me to turn and look at something. I quickly lifted my face. As I turned my gaze to the spot he indicated, I noticed an elderly woman, nearly bald and frail, positioned at the rear of the kindergarten. The spotlight illuminated her figure, making her presence unmistakable. I recall my brother beginning to mock her appearance. She wore a long, soaked gown that dripped with water, and her feet were bare. Though she seemed to be in dire condition, I reprimanded my brother, for we had been raised to show respect. As I observed the older individuals, I found it quite unkind for him to be laughing at the appearance of that lady. She was gesturing for us to approach, yet there was an unmistakable hint of anger in her demeanor, as if we had committed some offense. My brother and I began to walk in her direction, but she retreated further back. Intrigued, we followed her, eager to uncover her identity and intentions. However, just as we were about 5 meters away from her, a neighbor intervened. The man emerged from his house, calling out to us with a sense of urgency and distress. We glanced towards the old lady, still in sight, but shrouded in shadows where the light failed to reach. Concerned, we approached the neighbor, who greeted us with a sharp slap to the back of our heads, questioning our judgment in associating with a stranger. We recounted the events, mentioning the lady's apparent anger. He sternly warned us never to follow her again under any circumstances. Due to her unkindness and harmful actions towards the children, I inquired about the specifics of those actions. However, he responded by slapping me on the back of the head, insisting that I stop asking foolish questions and simply listen. This neighbor was someone we trusted deeply. He had been my father's best friend since childhood. He led us to our front door and informed our dad that he needed to speak with him. Dad's expression turned reproachful as he realized we must have done something wrong, prompting him to directly ask his friend what had transpired. This one responded by sending us to the kitchen with our mom, and so he did. My dad informed us that Mom had already prepared dinner and was waiting for him in the kitchen, while I was in the dining room waiting for Mom to serve us. I could clearly hear the conversation between my dad and the neighbor. My brother was distracted and didn't catch anything, but I was very attentive. When they were alone in the living room, the neighbor told my dad that he had seen us just as we were walking by, towards the old lady from school. I recall this phrase vividly, as I had never encountered this woman before. My father seemed somewhat alarmed, and then the neighbor advised him to keep a watchful eye on us, warning against walking alone at night in that area. After that, he bid farewell and departed. That evening, before we settled down for the night, my father entered our room and instructed my brother and me that, under no circumstances, should we approach that woman again, regardless of whether she spoke to us or called us. He emphasized that she was dangerous and reiterated the same warning. The neighbor had mentioned before that she did terrible things to the children. I asked again what kind of terrible things she did, but once more, Dad repeated what the neighbor said. Don't ask foolish questions, just listen. From that day on, my father forbade us from playing there at night. In fact, we started going home early, And I never heard anything about that so-called old lady from school again until I turned 16. By then, we had already moved to the city, and it was my dad's birthday. My uncles from town would visit him regularly, and each time they came, we enjoyed ourselves immensely. We would gather outside, engaging in conversations about a myriad of topics and sharing stories. This was a cherished tradition, particularly when the tales lent towards horror, those spine-chilling accounts of the dead and the eerie happenings in the towns. It was during one of these gatherings that I once again heard about the old lady from the school. We were in the midst of sharing jokes and reminiscing about my uncle's youth when, quite unexpectedly, my dad brought up a memory involving his friend Dawn. Manuel had brought us home after spotting us walking toward an elderly woman we had noticed at school. I replied affirmatively, as the memory was vivid in my mind. Dad then shared that during their childhood, only Uncle Julian and Don Manuel were able to see her. He mentioned that neither he nor my mother ever caught a glimpse of this woman. He explained that she wasn't truly alive. Instead, she resembled a kind of tormented spirit that manifested in that location, visible only to certain children, specifically those she chose. When my father spoke, I anticipated a burst of laughter or perhaps a playful scare, as he often did. Yet, he remained serious, as did my uncles and aunts present. Dad continued, recounting how this spirit had haunted the area for decades, believed to be the restless soul of a woman who ended her life by leaping into the well behind the school. That well, closed for over 30 years, is now secured by an iron cage to keep people at bay, following numerous incidents over the years. Several children vanished after being spotted playing in that area at night, only to be discovered inside that well. My father expressed deep gratitude to his friend for safeguarding us that night, as we had considered following that spirit. Who knows what fate awaited us if we had. Wishing you a day filled with health and happiness. Join me on my channel for enthralling narratives of true horror stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.